Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, but when you looked, there was no one there? What if the danger wasn't just in your head? Tonight, we're diving into 4 real-life horror stories that prove your home isn't always as safe as you think. But before we get into these chilling tales, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button if you love creepy stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now, turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare yourself for some truly unsettling encounters. Story 1. The Watcher in the Snow. I've always loved the quiet that comes with living alone in a house tucked away in the woods. It's the kind of silence that lets you hear the snow falling, the creak of settling wood, the soft sigh of the wind against the windows. My only company was Buddy, my German Shepherd, and he was all the security I thought I'd ever need. But that night, when he started growling low at the back door, his ears pinned back and his body tense, something in my gut told me this wasn't just some stray animal passing through. At first I tried to brush it off, murmuring a half-hearted, "It's nothing, boy," but he didn't settle. His gaze stayed locked on the glass, teeth bared slightly, as if something or someone was right outside, just beyond the porch light's reach. The next morning, I found the footprints, fresh, crisp in the untouched snow, leading from the tree line straight to my bedroom window. My stomach tightened as I followed them with my eyes, my breath clouding in the cold air. The steps didn't just stop at the window. They lingered, circling slightly, as if whoever had stood there had been watching for a long time, longer than I wanted to think about. My first instinct was to rationalize, maybe some lost hiker, maybe a prank, but the footprints didn't lead away. There were no retreating steps, no indication of someone leaving. It was like they had just appeared and then vanished. Buddy sniffed at the tracks, his fur bristling, and let out a low whimper. I didn't like the way that made me feel. That entire day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed by a window, I found myself glancing outside, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line. But there was never anything there, just the bare, skeletal branches swaying in the cold wind. Still, Buddy was restless, pacing near the back door, ears flicking at every little sound. By the time night fell, I told myself I was being paranoid. I double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains shut, and went to bed. But sometime around 2 a.m., Buddy's deep, guttural growl woke me up again. This time, it wasn't the back door. It was my bedroom window. The room was dark, but I could see Buddy standing stiff at the foot of the bed, his body tense. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had him so worked up. And then I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of the window latch being tested from the outside. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. My first instinct was to reach for the bat I kept near the nightstand, but I was frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. The sounds stopped, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Buddy lunged at the window, barking wildly, his claws scraping against the floorboards. By the time I found the courage to move, to yank open the curtain, there was nothing there, just the faint outline of footprints in the snow below, leading back into the woods. I barely slept after that. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind outside sent a fresh wave of paranoia through me. I kept telling myself I should call the police, but what would I even say? Someone standing outside my house at night. By morning, the footprints were gone, buried under a fresh layer of snow, as if the whole thing had never happened. But Buddy wasn't acting normal. He stuck close to me, tail low, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. Even when I let him out for his usual morning routine, he refused to go past the porch, just staring out toward the trees with his hackles raised. That alone was enough to keep me on edge all day. When night came, I didn't even pretend to feel safe. I kept every light on, made sure every door and window was locked, and even moved a chair in front of the back door just to feel like I was doing something. I stayed up late, sitting on the couch with Buddy curled up at my feet, waiting though I wasn't sure for what. And then, around 3 a.m., Buddy's head snapped up. His ears perked, his body stiffened. A second later, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the snow. Not on the porch this time, not at my bedroom window. This time, they circled the house, a full lap, the crunch of boots on fresh snow, moving steadily, methodically. My chest tightened as I realized what was happening. They were testing, looking for a way in. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Buddy was rigid beside me, his eyes locked on the front door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, The footsteps slowed near the back of the house, pausing just beyond the kitchen window. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Then came the sound I was dreading, the rattle of the doorknob. Not frantic, not forceful, just slow, deliberate pressure. Testing, feeling for weakness. I gripped the bat in my hands, my knuckles white, but I felt utterly useless. What was I supposed to do? Throw open the door and confront whatever was out there? Every rational thought in my head told me to stay put, to wait it out. But the moment I heard the metallic click of the lock being tested, like someone was trying to pick it, I snapped. I jumped up and hit the porch light switch. Buddy lunged forward, barking furiously, his body slamming against the door. I expected to hear footsteps retreating, the sound of someone running, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadow darting away, just silence. I hesitated before inching toward the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peeked outside, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the pale light reflecting off the snow, stood a figure, tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark shape, blending into the shadows of the trees. But I knew, without a doubt, that it was them. The one who had been circling my house. The one who had stood at my bedroom window. And they weren't leaving. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that figure in the trees. 5 seconds? A minute? Time felt stretched, distorted by the sheer wrongness of the situation. Buddy was still barking like he wanted to tear through the door and rip the intruder apart. But the figure didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there watching. My mind raced with what to do. Should I call the police? Go outside with the bat? Stay put and hope they'd leave? Every option felt useless. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they took a step backward, not turning, not running, just stepping deeper into the dark, one slow, deliberate movement at a time, until the trees swallowed them completely. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake on the couch with Buddy at my feet, his ears still twitching at every little sound. The silence outside felt even worse than the noises had. I wanted to believe it was over, that whoever it was had decided to leave. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And when the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, I saw the proof. More footprints in the snow, not just circling the house this time. They were everywhere, leading up to every window, stopping at the doors, standing still in places for long stretches, as if they had been there for hours, watching, waiting. By the time the sun was fully up, I had convinced myself to leave. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I didn't care if I had no real proof of danger. Everything in me was screaming that staying in that house for another night was a mistake. I packed a bag, grabbed Buddy's leash, and went straight to my truck. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints. They didn't just wander around the house this time. They led directly from the tree line to my truck, right up to the driver's side door. And then, nothing. No tracks leading away, no retreat. It was as if whoever or whatever had been out there had walked up to my vehicle and simply disappeared. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, uneven puffs in the cold air. Buddy was growling low beside me, his body tense. I didn't want to get in the truck. I didn't want to open the door. But I had no choice. With my heart pounding, I forced myself to check the truck. I yanked open the door, half expecting something or someone to be inside, waiting. But the cab was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, but that didn't make me feel any better. I threw my bag onto the passenger seat, got Buddy in, and locked the doors the second I was inside. The key trembled in my hand as I shoved it into the ignition, twisting hard. The engine roared to life, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I had control again. But just as I was about to shift into drive, Buddy let out a low, guttural whine, his eyes locked onto something in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see, but I had to. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the mirror, and there, standing at the edge of the tree line, exactly where they had vanished the night before, was the figure, still watching. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just some trespasser, some creep messing with me. There was something deeply wrong about them, something that made the air feel heavier. The light seemed dimmer. My hands were ice cold on the wheel, my breath shallow. And then, as if sensing that I was looking, the figure tilted its head, just slightly, just enough to let me know it saw me, that it had always seen me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning against the snow before catching traction. Buddy let out a sharp bark as the truck lurched forward, but I didn't cry, just needed to get away. As I sped down the long, winding road that led from my house to the main highway, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road. But there was nothing. No movement. Just empty, snow-covered trees stretching endlessly in both directions. It wasn't until I was miles away, the house nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror, that I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were still shaking against the wheel. Buddy had settled, but his ears were still perked, as if he wasn't entirely convinced we were safe yet. And honestly, neither was I even now. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know what it wanted. But I do know one thing: I was never supposed to see it. It had been watching, studying, waiting. And the second I realized it was there, it let me know that it knew. That, more than anything, is what haunts me. Story 2. The Man in the Shed. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to post something like this. But after what happened to me, I can't just keep it to myself. I lived alone in a small house outside Denver, working as a mechanic. It wasn't much, but I liked the quiet. My garage was my sanctuary. Tools lined up perfectly, the smell of oil and metal in the air. I had a fridge out there where I kept beers and snacks for when I worked late. A couple of weeks ago, I started noticing little things food missing. Beer cans not where I left them. At first I thought I was just being careless, but then it kept happening. Not a lot, just small amounts, like someone was being careful not to take too much. That's when I got paranoid. I live in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors close enough to just borrow stuff without asking. So I set up a cheap trail camera outside, pointing at my garage. I expected to see a raccoon, or maybe some local kid messing around. But when I checked the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. There was a man crawling out of my shed. Not walking, crawling. His movements were slow, almost unnatural, like he was trying to stay low to the ground. And then he just stood there, staring at my house for what felt like forever. I must have watched that footage a dozen times, hoping I was seeing things wrong. But it was clear. He came out of my shed, stood in the dark, and just watched. He didn't come closer, didn't try the doors. He just stood there, staring. I called the cops immediately. They came out, checked the shed, and that's when it got worse. Inside, there was an old sleeping bag, a pile of trash, and this part still makes my skin crawl. A notebook. It was filled with notes about me, my work hours, when I came and went, even little details like how I sometimes left my bedroom window unlocked. One entry said, "He doesn't check the shed." That one really got me. The cops took it seriously, but by the time they searched the area, the guy was gone. No sign of where he went. They told me to keep my doors locked, maybe install some security cameras. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the footage, expecting to see him again. But days passed, and nothing happened. I started to convince myself it was over, that he'd moved on now that he'd been discovered. But I was wrong. The real nightmare hadn't even started yet. About a week after the cops came, I was finally starting to relax. I even laughed about it with a buddy over the phone, saying, "Guess I'm not interesting enough for a stalker." That night, I was exhausted from a long day at the shop. I locked up like usual, checked the doors twice, and crashed hard. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. At first I thought I imagined it just the house settling. Maybe. But then I heard it again. A soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My stomach turned to ice. I wasn't alone. I reached for my phone, barely breathing, and opened the security app. The live feed popped up, showing different angles of my house. Nothing in the garage, nothing outside. Then I switched to the living room camera and, I swear to God, my blood went cold. He was there, standing in the dark, just barely lit by the camera's night vision. But he wasn't just standing. He was looking directly into the camera, grinning, a wide, unnatural grin that made my skin crawl. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before. My whole body locked up, like if I moved even an inch, he'd somehow know. He wasn't doing anything, wasn't moving, wasn't searching for valuables, just standing there, staring into the camera, smiling, like he knew I was watching, like he wanted me to see him. My breathing was too loud. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I knew I had to call the cops, but my brain felt scrambled, stuck between fight and flight. Then, as if he got bored, he moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward the hallway, the one that led to my bedroom. My bedroom? That's when I snapped out of it. I bolted upright, heart slamming in my chest, and called 911. I didn't whisper. I didn't stay quiet. I wanted him to hear me. "There's someone in my house," I hissed into the phone. keeping my eyes locked on the feed. But by the time I looked back at the screen, he was gone. Just gone. I didn't hear him, didn't see movement, nothing. 1 second, he was there, grinning into the camera. The next, he had vanished. But I knew he hadn't left. He was inside my house. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But where? I was trapped. My bedroom had one door leading to the hallway and a single window one I wasn't even sure was locked. My hands were sweating so much I could barely keep hold of my phone as I whispered to the dispatcher, "He's inside. I don't know where he is." They told me to stay put, to keep quiet, that officers were on their way. But then I heard it, a noise so subtle, so quiet, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Breathing, just outside my bedroom door. Slow, measured breaths, like someone standing completely still on the other side. Listening, I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay silent, but I knew he was there. He knew exactly where I was, and worst of all, he had no idea how long he had been standing there. I felt completely helpless. My back was against the wall, my mind racing through every possible scenario. If I made a noise, would he come in? If I stayed still, would he just stand there, listening? The breathing didn't stop. Slow, patient, like he had all the time in the world. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. The dispatcher was still on the line, telling me to stay calm. But how the hell was I supposed to do that? There was a man outside my door, a man who had been living in my shed, watching me, studying me, and now he was inside. Then, the worst sound imaginable. The doorknob rattled, just a tiny movement, like he was testing it. I almost lost it right there. My body tensed, every muscle locking up, waiting for the door to swing open. But it didn't. Instead, after a long, agonizing moment, I heard the softest sound of footsteps, bare feet against the hardwood floor moving away. He was leaving, or at least, I thought he was. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe properly until I heard the distant wail of sirens cutting through the night. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. The footsteps had faded, but I wasn't stupid enough to think he was gone. I kept my phone clutched in a death grip, eyes locked on the door, waiting for something, anything. The dispatcher was still on the line, saying the officers were almost there, but my brain barely registered it. Every second stretched painfully long, and I kept expecting to see the doorknob turn again. Then, a sudden noise from the security feed made me flinch. My phone screen still showed the live footage, and as the sirens grew louder, I switched through the cameras frantically, and there he was, standing in my backyard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. He was facing the house. That awful grin still stretched across his face. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't looking at the camera anymore. He was looking up, directly at my bedroom window. My blood ran cold. He knew exactly where I was. He had been inside my house just moments ago, and now he was outside, staring up at my window like he could still see me. The grin on his face wasn't just unsettling, it was deliberate. Like he was enjoying this. Like he wanted me to know that locked doors and sirens didn't matter to him. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my phone. The dispatcher kept asking if I was still there, but I couldn't even form words. I just stared at the screen, at that horrible, stretched out smile. Then, just as the first set of red and blue lights flashed through the yard, he moved. Not frantically, not like someone running from the cops. He just turned and walked, calmly, slowly, disappearing into the tree line at the edge of my property. The officers arrived seconds later, swarming the place, clearing every room, checking the doors and windows. But I already knew the truth. They weren't going to find him. He was gone. And somehow, that was worse than if they had caught him right there. The cops stayed for over an hour, searching the property, asking me the same questions over and over. Did I recognize him? Had I seen him before? Did I have any enemies? The answer was always no. I didn't know him. I didn't know why he had chosen me. And that was the part that scared me the most. This wasn't personal. It wasn't revenge or some unfinished business. I was just a guy who lived alone, and for whatever reason, that made me his target. They found signs that someone had been inside, smudges on the walls, dirt tracked in from bare feet, but no forced entry, no broken windows. That meant one thing. He had already been inside before tonight. Maybe days ago, maybe longer. The thought made me sick. The officers promised to patrol the area for the next few nights, but I knew it wouldn't matter. He was gone. And if he didn't want to be found, They weren't going to find him. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the cops left, even after checking every door and window 3 times over, I just sat there in my locked bedroom, watching the security feed, waiting for something, anything. But the cameras showed nothing. The man was gone, and the silence was suffocating. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was shifting. I told myself he wouldn't come back, that the cop's presence had scared him off. But deep down, I wasn't sure. And when the first light of dawn finally crept through my blinds, I realized something chilling. I wasn't relieved. I was just waiting for the next time. I called off work and spent the day installing new locks, reinforcing the doors, even putting bars on the windows. My garage, my once beloved sanctuary, now felt tainted. I couldn't even bring myself to step inside the shed. I didn't want to know if he'd left anything behind. The cops had already cleared it, but that didn't matter. The idea of standing in the same space he had lived in made my skin crawl. Instead, I spent the next few days trapped in my own home, exhausted but unable to sleep, jumping at every little noise. I was living in fear, and I hated it. A week passed, then 2. Nothing happened. Slowly, I began to convince myself it was really over. Maybe he had moved on, found someone else to haunt. Maybe I'd been lucky. But paranoia doesn't fade easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin. Every time I walked past a window, I half expected to see him standing there, staring up at me. And then, one night, just as I started to believe I was safe, I heard it. It was subtle at first, a faint tapping. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, ears straining. Maybe it was just a branch against the window. Maybe my exhausted brain was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, rhythmic, deliberate, a slow, steady tap-tap, like someone was knocking not on my door, but on the glass. My stomach twisted. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and pulled up the security feed. The cameras showed nothing at first. The porch was empty. The yard was still. But when I switched to the feed for the side window, my breath caught in my throat. He was there, not standing, not watching from a distance. He was crouched just below the window frame, his face tilted upward, his eyes locked onto mine through the lens. And he was still smiling, that same awful, knowing grin. My blood ran cold. He knew I was watching, knew I was awake. He had been waiting, just like I had. And now, he wanted me to know that this wasn't over. My fingers fumbled to dial 911, my voice barely more than a whisper as I choked out the words. But even as the dispatcher assured me officers were on their way, I knew the truth. He wasn't going to be caught, not tonight, maybe not ever. And the worst part? I didn't think he wanted to hurt me. No, this was something else, something worse. He wanted me to live with this, to always wonder if he was watching, to never feel safe again. And as the sirens echoed in the distance, his grin widened, and he slipped back into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but my own terror. And that's exactly what he wanted. Story 3. The stolen key. I've lived alone for the past 5 years, and in all that time, I never really worried about security. My neighborhood is quiet, mostly older couples and families, the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked during the day. I had a spare key hidden under my doormat. Lazy habit, I know, but I never thought much of it. A few days ago, though, I noticed it was gone. At first, I assumed I had moved it and forgotten, or maybe the wind had blown it away. But something about it nagged at me. The mat was perfectly in place, no sign of disturbance, and yet the key was simply gone. I told myself it was nothing, but for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I had been careless in a way I would regret. That night, for the first time in years, I locked my bedroom door. I felt silly doing it, but the thought of that missing key sat in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I went to bed as usual, scrolling on my phone until I dozed off. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. No reason, no sound, just that strange, immediate awareness that something was wrong. My room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a street lamp outside. Then I heard it, the sound of a key sliding into a lock. Not my front door, not the back, but inside. Inside my house. I froze. My heart slammed so hard against my ribs, I thought whoever was out there might hear it. The lock turned with an agonizing slowness, a deliberate, careful movement, like someone trying not to wake me. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that my half-asleep brain was playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. a shadow moved across the small gap under my bedroom door. Not the shifting blur of headlights or the swaying of tree branches outside. This was solid. A shape? A person standing just outside my room. I slid out of bed as silently as I could, barely breathing, and slipped into my closet. It was small, cramped, filled with hanging clothes that felt suffocating as I wedged myself between them. My phone was still on my nightstand, stupid. So. I was trapped with nothing but my own racing thoughts. Then came the worst part. The door handle. It turned once, softly, then again, more firmly. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood, begging that the lock would hold. A long silence stretched out, and then, in the dark, I heard it. The faintest sound of fingers trailing across the wood of my door, slow and deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't just trying to get in. They wanted me to know they were there. I don't know how long I stayed in that closet, barely breathing, my entire body locked in place. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears like a drum. Then, finally, footsteps. Slow, steady, moving away from my door. I didn't feel relief, only more dread. They weren't in a hurry. Whoever it was, they weren't afraid of being caught. The footsteps faded toward the living room, and after a few minutes, silence swallowed the house again. But I knew deep in my gut that they were still there, just waiting. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. When I woke up, sunlight was filtering through the blinds, casting soft streaks of light on my closet door. For a second, I felt disoriented, like maybe the whole thing had been a dream. But then I stepped out. My bedroom door was still locked, just as I had left it. Nothing in my room was touched. Nothing in the house seemed disturbed. But as I crept toward the front door, I hesitated. A deep, gut-wrenching fear settled in my stomach before I even looked down. And when I finally did, my blood ran cold. The spare key, my spare key, it was back, sitting neatly under the doormat, as if it had never been gone. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at that damn key. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Someone had taken it, used it to get inside my house, walked around while I was sleeping, and then put it back. Why? My mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but there wasn't one. If they wanted to rob me, why not take anything? If they wanted to hurt me, why didn't they? The realization made my stomach twist. They hadn't come to steal or harm. They had just watched. I locked every door and window in the house, double-checked them, then triple-checked, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Someone had been inside. Someone knew how to get in. And worse, someone had been close enough to my bedroom door to touch it. I didn't call the police. What would I even say? There was no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen, no proof that anything had actually happened. Just a key that had disappeared and then mysteriously returned. By noon, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. That night, though, as I lay in bed, staring at my locked door, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the dark, someone was still watching. I barely slept that night. Every little noise sent my heart racing, the creak of the house settling, the rustle of leaves outside. Even my own breathing felt too loud. At some point, exhaustion must have won because I woke up to my alarm blaring, my body stiff from lying in the same tense position for hours. I hesitated before getting out of bed, listening, waiting, but the house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like something is just out of sight, holding its breath along with you. I forced myself to move, to get up and face the day, but the feeling never left me. I avoided looking at the doormat as I left for work. I couldn't stand the thought of that key sitting there, like a silent reminder that someone, somewhere, had been inside my house. I told myself I'd change the locks, maybe even install a security camera, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whoever did this hadn't broken in. They had used the key. They had walked through my house like they belonged there. And worst of all, they had put everything back exactly how it was, except for one thing. That night, as I was locking up, I noticed something strange. The door to my bedroom, the same one I had locked myself behind just the night before, was now slightly open, just enough for someone to have peeked inside. I stood there, staring at that barely open door, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew I had locked it. My fingers had checked that knob 3 times before I went to sleep. And yet, here it was, open just enough that someone could have stood there, watching me in the dark. My skin went cold. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything, but I felt that awful, gut-wrenching sensation that I was not alone. I refused to sleep in that room that night. I grabbed a blanket and crashed on the couch. Every single light in the house left on. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every creak of the house sent my heart into my throat. Every passing car outside made me flinch. I clutched my phone in my hand, ready to call someone. But who? The police wouldn't do anything, and I didn't have anyone nearby who could come over. So I just lay there, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No footsteps. No doors creaking open. Just the unbearable weight of knowing that someone had been in my home and they could come back anytime they wanted. I didn't stay in that house another night. The next morning I packed a bag, booked a hotel, and left without looking back. I didn't care how paranoid it made me seem. I knew, deep in my bones, that something was wrong. My home no longer felt like mine. It felt like something else had taken root there. Something unseen, something waiting. At the hotel, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The room was unfamiliar, but it felt safe. I locked the door, latched the security chain, and checked the windows 3 times before I let myself sit down. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I told myself, but the fear didn't care about reason. That night I slept in fits, waking up to every noise, heart racing, mind stuck in that moment of sheer terror back in my bedroom. The sound of the key in the lock, the shadow under the door, the slow, deliberate touch against the wood. It played over and over in my mind until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I awoke, sunlight was filtering through the curtains, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. When I stepped out of bed and turned toward the door, my stomach dropped. There, on the floor just inside my hotel room, was a key. Not my house key, not one that belonged to this hotel. Just an ordinary key, sitting on the carpet as if it had been placed there with careful intention. My vision swam, my legs unsteady beneath me as I backed away. This wasn't possible. I had locked the door, latched the chain. No one could have gotten in. No one should have been able to get in. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called the front desk. They sent someone up within minutes, a middle-aged man with a skeptical expression. He checked the door, the lock, the chain. Everything was intact. No sign of forced entry. No logical way for that key to be there. He gave me a polite but dismissive nod, took the key, and left me standing there, still trembling. I checked out that afternoon. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I drove aimlessly for hours, stopping only when exhaustion and hunger forced me to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that key. Not the one from the hotel, the one from my house, the one that had disappeared and then returned. And I realized something horrifying. They had never needed it. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching. They were showing me that no lock could keep them out. I never went back to that house. I sold it, sight unseen, barely caring about the loss. Some things aren't worth risking. Some things you just run from. I moved across the country, changed my number, changed everything I could about my life. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with that same feeling, that strange, immediate awareness that something is wrong. And every time, I find myself holding my breath, waiting, listening, just in case. Somewhere in the dark, someone is still watching. Story 4. The fake gas inspector. I work from home, so I'm used to random knocks on the door. Delivery guys, solicitors, neighbors needing something. But that afternoon, when I heard the knock, something felt off. It wasn't a normal knock, not a rhythmic one, but slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other side was testing how it sounded. I hesitated before opening it, and when I did, a man stood there wearing a cheap-looking navy jacket, the kind you'd expect from a utility company, but without a logo. He had a clipboard in one hand and the other tucked in his pocket. Before I could say anything, he spoke first. Gas inspection. Just routine. Need to check your pipes inside. His voice was flat, like he'd rehearsed the line 100 times but didn't actually believe it. I asked for his ID. That's when the first alarm bell really went off in my head. He hesitated. It was small, barely a pause, but enough to make my stomach tighten. Then he waved vaguely down the street, like that was supposed to mean something. I glanced past him. No truck, no van, nothing that suggested he worked for the gas company. Not today, I said, stepping back to close the door. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince me. He just stood there, staring at me for a second too long. before finally turning away. But he didn't head toward the street. Instead, he walked along the side of my house, disappearing out of view. I shut and locked the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just avoided something really, really bad. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I double-checked the locks before going to bed, even wedging a chair under the front door handle, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. Not loud, but distinct. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on gravel. My house has a basement with an external door leading to the backyard, and that's exactly where the sound was coming from. My stomach dropped. I crept to the back window, keeping the lights off, and peered outside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dim glow of the streetlights, casting shadows across the yard. Then I noticed them footprints, fresh ones, leading right up to the basement door. My heart pounded in my ears. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but then, silence. No movement, no more footsteps. I waited, staring at the footprints, half expecting someone to come into view, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to check the basement door, my pulse hammering with every step. The lock was still secure, no signs of forced entry. But those footprints, someone had been there, standing outside in the cold, just watching. I barely slept after that. Every creak in the house made me jump, and I kept thinking about that man from earlier. Had he come back? And if so, why hadn't he tried to break in? What was he waiting for? The next morning, I felt ridiculous for how paranoid I'd been. Maybe it was just some random person cutting through my yard. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then, as I was taking out the trash, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, called out to me from her porch. She looked uneasy. "Did that gas man come by your place yesterday?" My stomach clenched. I nodded. "Yeah, but I didn't let him in." Her face tightened. "Good. He went into Sarah's house down the block." Next day, I saw her changing all her locks. That sent a chill through me. I didn't know Sarah well, but the fact that she immediately changed her locks after letting that guy in, that wasn't normal. I asked Mrs. Callahan if she knew anything else, but she just shook her head and muttered something about bad people before going back inside. That was enough for me. I called the gas company. Their answer was exactly what I feared. They hadn't sent anyone to my area. There was no inspection scheduled, no workers assigned. That man wasn't with them. I hung up feeling sick. If he wasn't from the gas company, then who the hell was he? For the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Nothing obvious, just a weird sense of unease every time I passed a window or stepped outside. I started double-checking my locks every night, making sure the basement door was secure. Eventually, the paranoia faded a little. No more footprints, no strange knocks, no sign of that man. I convinced myself it had just been a near miss with some scammer or would-be burglar. But then, one night, I woke up to something worse. It was 3:12 a.m. I remember because I checked my phone right away. The air in my room felt wrong, thick, like stepping into a space that hadn't been disturbed in years. I sat up, and that's when I noticed it. My bedroom door, which I always closed before bed, was slightly open, just enough for a sliver of darkness to bleed into the room. I hadn't heard it creak open. I hadn't heard anything. My pulse slammed against my ribs as I stared at the gap. I wanted to believe it had been the wind, or maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. But then I noticed the front door. From where I sat, I could see down the hallway, past the living room. The front door was wide open. I didn't move at first. My brain just refused to process what I was looking at. The door wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open, yawning into the night. A sickening wave of fear crawled up my spine. I knew, without a doubt, that I had locked it before going to bed. I forced myself to get up, my legs shaky, and crept toward the front door. The air outside was still, almost unnaturally so. No wind, no distant traffic, just silence. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard, half expecting to see someone standing there in the dark. But there was no one, nothing, just the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I shut the door, locked it deadbolt, and all then turned to check my security cameras. That's when my stomach dropped again. The system was on, the cameras were powered, but there was no footage. The entire night's recordings were just gone. No error message, no sign of tampering, just blank space where hours of footage should have been. My hands were shaking as I restarted the system, hoping it was some kind of glitch. But deep down, I knew better. Someone or something had been inside my house, walking through my rooms, close enough to touch me while I slept. And I had no idea how, or why, or if they'd come back. I barely slept after that. Every sound in the house made my skin crawl. I kept the lights on, sat in the living room with a baseball bat, jumping at every creak in the walls. The worst part was knowing that someone had been inside, that they had walked through my house and left without taking anything. That felt more terrifying than if I had been robbed at. At least then I'd have a reason, a motive to cling to. But this felt like something else entirely. The next morning, I checked the locks again, tested the security system, even called the company to see if they could explain the missing footage. They had nothing, no outages, no system failures, nothing that would explain why my cameras had gone dark at the exact time my door was standing open. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. That's when I remembered the footprints, the ones I had seen outside my basement door weeks ago. My stomach twisted as I forced myself to go check the backyard, just to be sure. And sure enough, there were new ones, fresh, leading up to the basement door again. I felt like I was going to be sick. The footprints were deep, clearer than last time, like whoever made them had just been there. I followed them with my eyes, tracking the way they led right up to the basement door, then stopped. No prints leading away, just a single path directly to the door, as if whoever had been standing there had either vanished or gone inside. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob, testing it. Still locked. I forced myself to check the latch. The hinges, no sign of forced entry, but that didn't make me feel any better. I backed away and did the only thing I could think of, grabbed a bag, threw some clothes in it, and left. I couldn't stay there. Not that night. Not after this. I checked into a motel a few miles away, sat on the bed, and just tried to breathe. My phone sat next to me, and I kept staring at it, debating whether to call the police. But what would I even say? That someone had been in my house, left no sign of entry, erased my security footage, and somehow managed to walk to my basement door without leaving a single footprint leading away. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. I stayed at the motel that night, barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that basement door, those footprints, the front door hanging open like an invitation. I kept thinking about that man, the fake gas inspector. Had this all started with him? Or was he just part of something bigger, something I didn't understand? I had no answers, only the suffocating feeling that I was being toyed with, watched, led into some kind of trap. The next morning, I forced myself to go back home. The house felt different when I stepped inside, like the air had weight to it, thick and stale. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing, the basement door. It was unlocked. My breath hitched. I knew for a fact that I had locked it before I left. I hadn't touched it since checking those footprints, but now the door sat slightly ajar, just a crack, as if someone had been standing on the other side, listening, waiting. I didn't open it. I didn't even try. I just turned around, walked out of the house, and called a locksmith. The locksmith arrived an hour later, an older guy who had probably seen it all. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed every single lock in the house changed, including the basement. He didn't ask questions, just got to work. While he was busy, I stood outside, my skin crawling with the feeling that someone was still inside, watching from the windows. I forced myself not to look. I just wanted it done. When he finished, I paid him in cash and watched as he tested the new deck. "This'll keep just about anyone out," he said, giving the front door a firm push. It didn't budge. That should have made me feel safer. It didn't. That night, I slept with the lights on, a knife on my nightstand. Nothing happened. No noises, no footprints, no open doors. And yet, I still woke up at 3:12 a.m., heart racing, feeling that same thick, oppressive air in my room. I stayed completely still, listening. The house was silent, too silent, like it was waiting. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, but the feeling didn't go away. That thick, heavy presence in the air, like something unseen, was just there, watching, waiting. I wanted to get up, to check the locks again, but a deeper, more primal instinct kept me frozen. Whatever this was, it wanted me to move. It was waiting for it. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, sunlight was spilling through my window. The house felt normal again, lighter. I got up, checking every door, every window. Everything was locked. The basement door was secure. My security system was still running, and this time, the footage was there. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing recorded at 3:12 a.m., but I knew something had been there. I could feel it in my bones. Weeks passed, and nothing happened after that. No more open doors, no more footprints, no strange men knocking on my door. But the worst part? I don't feel safe. Not really, because deep down, I know that whatever this was, it wasn't just some guy trying to break in. It wasn't about robbery, or a scam, or even me. It was about the house, and I don't think it's finished with me yet.